Kansas is coming to Mizzou Arena as the number one team in the country, at least for now. How can the Tigers pull the upset? I'll tell you right now on Locked On Mizzou.
You are Locked On Mizzou, your daily podcast on the Missouri Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, all you true sons and daughters, I'm John Miller, your Mizzou mafioso and the central scrutinizer of Missouri Tigers football and basketball. And you can get started this season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. And some portal news for Missouri, some definite slight negative news as Mekhi Miller has decided to enter the portal for Mizzou. What do the Tigers need out of the portal? Talk about that a little later. Plus, John Mateer from Washington State is another quarterback. This has been brought up a lot lately. I'm going to tell you my thoughts on him and the chances that Missouri has at landing that young man later in the show. But you know what? I'm sorry for teasing something yesterday that I didn't get to. Other than maybe forgetting to push record on the video, that's the one thing I hate doing the most. I really do. So here's the thing with Kansas. I said yesterday, hey, it's too bad. Basically, here's where I was going with my tease. I was saying, hey, obviously not ideal that Kansas maybe lost their first basketball game before playing Missouri. If you missed it, Kansas lost by a pretty good margin, by double digits in Omaha at Creighton for its first true road game. And on the Tigers, by the way, I'm just still, to be honest with you, not totally sure what to make of this team, primarily because I'm not 100% sure who is going to be playing night to night. For example, as an example, second half, Peyton Marshall has 14 big minutes for the Tigers. Well, he didn't play at all in the first half. What would you say the over-under is on minutes for Marshall? I could believe anything from 25 to 0 for Peyton Marshall in this basketball game against the Kansas Jayhawks. So on the rotations, just one more thing on this topic. It's almost been talked about too much in Mizzou circles, but to me, if you're going to play a lot of guys in basketball, then you need to play fast, simply put. And that doesn't necessarily mean you have to get a shot up quickly early in the shot clock, but it does mean you have to move a lot offensively, in my opinion. Think about Klay Thompson and Stephen Curry running around the half court for the Golden State Warriors for years. You got to try to wear the other team out defensively, and maybe that did happen to some extent in the second half against Cal on Tuesday. You've also got to play really hard defensively as well. Otherwise, I'm just simply seeing more cons than pros of that particular strategy. And again, going back to Cal, well, Dennis Gates basically played 7 or 8 guys in the second half compared to the 12 he played in the first half. And wouldn't you know it, Missouri played a heck of a lot better in the second half. So we'll see if that was just a one-off or a pattern and a trend we can watch going forward. Now, when it comes to Kansas, obviously this is a really good Kansas team, as they are basically every year under Bill Self. But are they number one in the country good? That I'm not so sure about. Now, don't get me wrong. I think they deserve to be number one based off their results so far, beating Duke on a neutral court, for example. But again, Kansas just lost to Creighton, and while Creighton's been a really good team lately, this isn't one of their best teams. At least it doesn't look like it so far. In fact, if you look at the KenPom rankings, that team is, well, not too far off in the ratings from our Missouri Tigers. So here's the thing with Kansas. They're really veteran-laden, number one. That's one thing you've got to like. If you're picking somebody to go a long way in the brackets in March, well, we're not picking Kansas, are we? But in theory, you'd love to have a team that's started by a big 7'2" center who's a fifth-year player and a true point guard who's as good in the country as a true offensive point guard in DaJuan Harris. another fifth-year player. That type of experience, quite simply, was unprecedented before this new world of college basketball called post-COVID. But you know what? I think this is probably the last year we're going to have these types of fifth-year guys. So is Kansas maybe, or should they be the favorite, considering they do have this sort of weird situation here? Not only that, KJ Adams on the wing as a fourth player. By the way, remember Zeke Mayo, a kid that Missouri was trying to recruit, definitely kicked the tires on him this past offseason. But once the Lawrence native, yes, Lawrence, Kansas native Mayo, and by the way, former South Dakota State Jackrabbit, got a Kansas offer, it was clear where that was ending up. And you know what? He's been okay. He hasn't knocked anybody's socks off here so far early in the season. So I don't know that that was a big miss by Missouri by any stretch of the imagination. Speaking of guys who Missouri used to recruit, Ryan Kalkbrenner for Creighton, another guy all the way back in the Konzo Martin era. He was a pretty good matchup against Dixon, and I thought bothered him in that game for sure. So to me, the question is, does that mean more of Josh Gray in this ball game? I would kind of think so. I would expect he's probably a 20-plus minute guy on Sunday. Also, you got to wonder how much Peyton Marshall is going to play. Can the true freshman hang with the fifth-year guy in Dickinson? Physically, I think he can. You just wonder the tricks of the trade, all that kind of good stuff. You wonder if Dickinson, with all of his experience and, yes, dirtiness, can maybe get the best of a young Peyton Marshall, of course. And the thing is, with Harris and Dickinson, those two 5-year players, they're really exactly who you think they are. There's no surprises there except, maybe the occasional stomp to the face by Hunter Dickinson. But at this point, can you really be surprised? But I digress. You got to think those NIL payments are rather hefty for those two young men, by the way. And a true point guard who knows exactly what Bill Self wants is a heck of an advantage. But I will say this, DaJuan Harris, the Rockbridge High School graduate, by the way, you got to make him score because he truly is a pass-first point guard, and I think you have to make him defend as well. Anthony Robinson is quite a bit bigger than Harris, who I would say is rather generously listed at 6'2" and 175 pounds. Can Robinson take advantage of Harris in the half court and maybe in the fast break as well with his superior size and athleticism? Well, based on what we've seen from Robinson so far, I really think he can. And that's one advantage that I think Missouri can have for sure. If Robinson can make Harris pay defensively, well, then I think Missouri's really got something there. And the other thing is, if they decide to take Harris off of Robinson in theory, well, who are you going to put him on? You're going to put him on Tamar Bates? That doesn't seem like the best matchup either. I could see early in the game Honor Boating being a guy who, while really talented, hasn't been looking at the basket much lately. If anything, if I'm Dennis Gates, I think I'm going to start Marquez Warwick in place of Honor Boating because the Tigers have not started very well offensively lately. I don't want to give DaJuan Harris the opportunity to just basically take possessions off defensively, and I think that may be what happens if Boating starts the game. On the other hand, if Boating starts, Harris does pick him up, you know what I want Honor to do? I want him to attack, try to score, drive. Again, 6'2", 175, I'd say that's soaking wet and probably in platform heels. So as good of a player as Harris is offensively, I do think there's a chance for Missouri with the superior size that they have at guard to take advantage of that. I think you've also got to make KJ Adams, who I brought up earlier. I think he's a really good player. I like his game, but I think you've got to make him shoot as well. I really do. Those two things, make KJ Adams shoot, make DaJuan Harris score and work on defense, and suddenly I think you've got a path to where Kansas is actually going to have to adjust to Missouri instead of the other way around. And coming up, more on the Missouri transfer portal quarterback market, including one guy I've had a lot of listeners and viewers bring up, Washington State quarterback John Mateer, who recently entered the transfer portal. No doubt he's a top option in the market Could he be an option for Missouri? Let's talk about that here in a minute. But first, Mint Mobile, because here's the thing: I love a great deal as much as the next guy, but I'm not going to go to Lawrence, Kansas to get it. Let's put it that way. Just to save a few bucks. No, Norm Stewart wouldn't like that. It's got to be easy. No hoops, no BS. So when Mint Mobile said it was easy to get wireless for $15 a month with the purchase of a 3-month plan, well, I called their bluff, and it turns out it really was that easy to get wireless for $15 a month. To get started, go to mintmobile.com/lockedoncollege, and there you'll see the right now all 3-month plans are only $15 a month, including the unlimited plan. Just find out how easy it is to switch to Mint Mobile and get 3 months of premium wireless service for $15 a month. To get this new offer and your new premium 3-month wireless plan for just $15 a month, go to mintmobile.com/lockedoncollege. That's mintmobile.com/lockedoncollege. Cut your wireless bill down to $15 a month at mintmobile.com/lockedoncollege. $45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 a month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited plan. Additional taxes, fees, and restrictions apply. See Mint Mobile for details. Now, ESPN Plus had an article recently about the 25 quarterbacks to watch in the portal. Not the 25 best players available in the portal, by the way. And I bring that up because one reason I haven't brought up John Mateer yet is until the last, 24 to 36 hours or so, Mateer was never officially in the portal. So for the most part, I'm just going to bring up the guys who have actually officially announced because, well, a lot of people get led astray on this type of thing, especially by social media and all that. But now that Mateer is in the portal, what about him? Well, I like the skill set, to be sure, and ESPN Plus has him as the number one guy to watch in the portal. So if you're Missouri, there's no doubt that you're interested. So obviously I understand why a bunch of my listeners have brought him up. But here's the thing. As I've said before, these top quarterbacks in particular, the top talent in general, well, these guys usually know what they're going to do when they've made an announcement. They've got a pretty good idea anyway, whether it's down to 2 or 3 visits, that kind of thing, or in some cases, they just know the landing spot. Well, here's the thing. Washington State and John Mateer's offensive coordinator, he just went to Oklahoma. Who else just entered the transfer portal? Yes, former Oklahoma quarterback now Jackson Arnold, who Missouri fans are quite familiar with. Well, let's do the math here. I think the timing there is suspicious, I would say, at best. So anyway, I'm just thinking, hey, John Mateer, if it turns out that, he's coming for a visit to Missouri, then I'll kick the tires real hard and do a deep dive for you. But until then, until proven otherwise, I'm basically expecting that he's going to be in Oklahoma sooner rather than later. Now, fortunately, as Missouri fans for the past couple of years here, we've been able to focus on players coming into the program in the portal and not necessarily the ones leaving, because for the most part, those players leaving haven't been huge contributors. Now, Mekhi Miller probably falls somewhere in the middle of those two extremes, and Mekhi Miller has announced he is entering the transfer portal, or at least there are reports out there from multiple sources that Miller is going to do so. And while Miller had, at least off the top of my head, a couple of really clutch catches on third down in 2023 that were important moments for the Tigers against Florida in particular is one I'm thinking of. Well, it did seem that Miller was passed maybe by some other players this season, including Daniel Blood and Joshua Manning as well. So it does make sense that maybe Miller would move on and try to find a landing spot here for his last season of college football, get a little more action, whatever Miller is into. The point is, really, he's probably as much of a high-level contributor as Missouri has lost in the past couple of seasons. that's a good thing because, of course, in the past, you've seen Missouri lose guys like Mekhi Wingo. Speaking of guys named Mekhi Wingo, Dominic Lovett, but that's been a couple years now. Really, the last couple years have been fruitful in the portal. Just huge net positives has been this new landscape, quite honestly. But with Miller gone, I will say that is another reason to want to have a wide receiver next year. And I've been saying for a while, other than quarterback, I think receiver is as important of a spot for Missouri to land a position as just about anywhere, because Luther Burden and Theo Weiss were just simply huge losses. Those are really productive players on two, well, hopefully 10-win seasons here, double-digit seasons here. Regardless, 20 wins the past two seasons, and Luther Burden and Theo Weiss were a big reason why. Now, sort of similar to Sam Horn and his situation with the Tigers, sure, there's a world where Sam Horn balls out next year and wins the starting quarterback position. But I just don't think you can count on that. You can't put all your eggs into that basket. Well, there's also a world where Josh Manning and Marquise Johnson, for example, are a really good number 1 and 2 combination. I can imagine that. I really can. Also, James Madison, Courtney Crutchfield, a couple freshmen on this year's squad can emerge. Daniel Blood seems likely to return, and somebody like Donovan Olubade in the true freshman class, he's talented enough, a top 100 national player. He could be in line for some action as well. But again, similar to quarterback, I just don't think you can simply count on those guys being your top pass receiver options, especially when you do have options. When you're a team like Missouri in the SEC for the millionth time, a strong NIL infrastructure that you can count on. There's no reason to rest on your laurels when you don't have to. And other than wide receiver, I think probably the two biggest spots that Missouri's got to focus on in the portal, and other than quarterback, of course, I'm going to just say defensive back in general. That's cornerback and safety. I just think those spots, well, at times just simply weren't good enough for Missouri, and the Tigers are losing a lot of players at the safety position, including Joseph Charleston, who made a huge play late in the season to help seal a Missouri victory against Arkansas. And also, the other important position got to be offensive line, though I think Missouri has some more promising young options there, maybe, at least at first glance, than they do at defensive back. Maybe I'll change my mind come this spring and fall, but right now, I do think that Logan Reichert and Talon Chander, Ryan Justice, Caleb Pyfrom, those type of guys, there's a chance that one of those four guys, especially Reichert, the more veteran guy there, could emerge next season as a real starter. So the fact that Missouri is going to have to replace two starters, losing Cameron Johnson and Marcus Bryant, it may not be quite as necessary to go into the portal as you might think. Plus, another position where Missouri's losing a ton of guys, but they have some young options, guys who played a decent bit this season, is linebacker, where Nick Rodriguez, Jeremiah Beasley, and Brayshawn Littlejohn all got some action. Brian Huff was a pretty highly thought of recruit as well. And finally, one thing I haven't counted on is Luke Bauer, who technically still has a year left if he wants, but he did leave on he did walk on senior day. So it does seem like Missouri probably will be looking for a punter in the portal as well. And you know what? I've got more basketball coming up here in just a little bit, including how Kansas is as good of an example of the changing landscape of college basketball the last few years that I can think of. And also more reason to believe while the Tigers can hang on Sunday. Let's get to that here in just a minute. But first, get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. I have to say, when I tuned in for the Kansas-Creighton game the other night, I was slightly surprised to see that KJ Adams had returned to the Jayhawks for another season, just because I think he's that good of a player. I thought, gee, wouldn't he be on to the NBA by now? But then I saw in his career, his 4-year career, by the way, not a full 4 years, but now in his 4th year with Kansas, he's 0 for 7 from three-point land. Oh, okay, well, now it makes more sense. It seems like to play in the NBA as a wing, being a three-point shooter is basically a requirement at this point. And Kansas, compared to most modern teams of college basketball, just doesn't shoot a ton of three-pointers in general. But really against Creighton, I thought the bigger problem for Kansas was finishing inside. So again, Ryan Kalkbrenner, the center for the Jays, well, he was probably as good a reason for that as any. So we'll see if Josh Gray can provide some resistance, Peyton Marshall, all that good stuff, or if Missouri tries to downsize a little bit. We'll just see how Dennis Gates plays it. I got to imagine you're going to be seeing a decent amount of Josh Gray and Peyton Marshall in this game. But again, to my earlier point there about KJ Adams and just being surprised that he's back, well, I think part of me, my brain still has to adjust to the new world of college basketball a little bit, where guys are just hanging around a lot more too, and the one and done type of players that even John Calipari started to move away from during the end of his tenure at Kentucky. Well, again, Kansas, hey, I'm old enough to remember when Kansas had really good and prominent freshmen, one and done guys, players like Andrew Wiggins and Joel Embiid, for example. Well, now they have one freshman on the entire roster. That's pretty shocking. Just to the point of how much experience this Kansas roster has. Well, Flory Badunga, the 14th best player in his class last season, at least according to one outlet, he's basically the backup to Hunter Dixon. So even your one freshman is not necessarily the most important guy on your roster whatsoever. A rotation player, but also a guy backing up one of your best players. So on certain nights, he may only play just a handful of minutes. I'll also point out that was Kansas's first true road game of the season. This will be their second true road game of the season, right in a row here. And again, Creighton really isn't, just on paper at least at this point in the season, is not dramatically better than Missouri or anything like that. In fact, the Jays had a 3-game losing streak in November to some solid teams, but to Nebraska, San Diego State, and Texas A&M. Again, all good programs there, but a 3-game losing streak there doesn't make you think that Creighton is heading for the Final Four or anything like that. One more thing to watch for Kansas. Will Rylan Griffin play? You may remember that name. Well, he's a transfer from Alabama, so it will be interesting to see if he plays or not in the basketball game. So Kansas with some slight injury concerns there. Obviously, I think Caleb Grill is a bigger concern for Missouri. I'm not really anticipating Grill playing at the moment. He was seen wearing a neck brace on the sidelines. So unless Dennis Gates and Caleb are doing sort of the Ted Kennedy thing here, I don't know. I'm expecting that Caleb Grill probably be out for another week or two at the very least. But certainly if he plays, that will be a pleasant surprise for Missouri, and will give Missouri a heck of a lot better chance to win. Remember, actually, Caleb Grill, I think maybe one of his last 2 games or something like that was at Lawrence against the Jayhawks, if I'm remembering correctly. Tigers hung in there pretty well in that game. Hey, give us a chance in Columbia against Mizzou Arena. We deserve a do-over after the first one in the Dennis Gates era there in what was otherwise a very good season for Missouri. So here's the deal. I'm going to come at you all very, very soon with a recap of this Kansas basketball game. In fact, let's just do it right after the game. Game's going to be over about 2 o'clock. That'll give me a few hours before the Kansas City Chiefs game starts at 7:20. Yeah, it sounds good. Let's do a little Sunday pod for you, a little Kansas recap. Hopefully it's a big win for the Tigers that I'll have to recap, but regardless, I'm going to be with you, easy for me to say, as always, right here on Locked On Mizzou.